In the summer of 1628, thousands of people lined the harbor of Stockholm to watch the most powerful warship on Earth set sail. It carried 64 bronze cannons, gold leaf carvings, and the pride of an entire kingdom. It sank in less than 20 minutes. It never even left the harbor. And the reason wasn't an enemy attack, a storm, or bad luck. It was a mistake so small, so easy to overlook, that almost no one on board even noticed it until the water started pouring in. This is the story of the Vasa, one of the most infamous shipwrecks in naval history, and one of the strangest because it didn't happen at sea. It happened in plain sight, in calm water, in front of the very people who built it. Today, you're going to find out exactly how a ship this massive, this expensive, and this heavily armed could collapse under nothing more than a light breeze, and why the people who built it may have known something was wrong long before it ever set sail. To understand why the Vasa mattered so much, you have to understand the world it was born into. In the early 1600s, Sweden was locked in a brutal war with Poland-Lithuania, fighting to expand its power across the Baltic region. King Gustavus Adolphus needed a navy that could dominate the Baltic Sea, and he needed it fast. So he commissioned a new class of warship, bigger, more heavily armed, and more intimidating than anything Sweden had built before. That ship was the Vasa. It took roughly 2 years and hundreds of skilled workers to build. Shipwrights, carvers, riggers, and sailmakers poured everything they had into it. A finished vessel stood about 226 feet long, weighed over 1,000 tons, and was covered in elaborate wooden sculptures meant to send one clear message to Sweden's enemies: fear us. But here's where the story gets complicated. Partway through construction, the king made a decision that would quietly doom the entire project. He wanted more firepower, so instead of the single gun deck the ship was originally designed for, he ordered a second one added on top. Now, on paper, that sounds like a simple upgrade. In practice, it meant taking a ship that was already built and adding dozens of heavy bronze cannons far higher up on the hull than the original design ever accounted for. Shipbuilding in the 1600s wasn't based on precise mathematical engineering the way it is today. There were no blueprints in the modern sense. No formal calculations for center of gravity. Master shipwrights relied on tradition, experience, and proportions passed down through generations. And the man overseeing the Vasa's construction, a shipbuilder named Henrik Hibbertson, died before the ship was even finished, taking much of his personal knowledge of the design with him. Here's the part almost nobody expects. Before the Vasa ever set sail, the crew already suspected something was wrong. Naval officials at the time actually performed a rough stability test. 30 men were ordered to run back and forth across the deck to see how much the ship would rock. On a normal, stable vessel, this test causes mild swaying. On the Vasa, the ship tilted so dramatically that the test had to be stopped early out of fear it might capsize right there at the dock. And yet, despite that warning sign, the launch date wasn't delayed. The king was anxious for his new warship to be ready, and nobody wanted to be the one to tell him his prized vessel might be unsafe. So why didn't anyone stop it? This is where the human side of the story becomes just as important as the engineering side. Gustavus Adolphus was away leading his army during much of the ship's construction, and by most historical accounts, he was known for being demanding and difficult to challenge. Contradicting the kin, especially over a project this expensive and this symbolic, was a serious risk. It's a pattern that shows up again and again throughout history. Warning signs get quietly buried when the person in charge doesn't want to hear bad news. Meanwhile, the physical problem with the ship kept getting worse. Adding that second gun deck raised the ship's center of gravity significantly. To compensate, more ballast, heavy stone, and gravel packed low in the hull should have been added to keep the vessel stable. But there simply wasn't enough room. The ship's hull, narrow to begin with, couldn't hold the amount of ballast needed to balance out all that extra weight sitting high above the waterline. And then, centuries later, researchers uncovered something even stranger. When the wreck was eventually studied in detail, Experts found that the ship wasn't just top-heavy, it was also asymmetrical. The planks on the port side of the hull were measurably thicker than the planks on the starboard side. In a ship this size, that kind of imbalance may seem tiny, but combined with an already unstable design, it meant the Vasa wasn't just leaning toward disaster, it was structurally uneven before it even touched the water. Historians believe this likely happened because different teams of shipwrights, using slightly different measurement standards common at the time, worked on opposite sides of the hull. In a design with almost no margin for error, that small inconsistency became one more factor working against the ship. On August 10, 1628, the Vasa finally set sail from Stockholm. Crowds gathered along the shoreline to watch. Cannons fired in celebration. The ship moved gracefully out into the harbor, sails unfurled, flags waving. Then a gust of wind hit. The ship tilted. Water began pouring in through the open lower gun ports, the same ports that had just fired a ceremonial salute. Crew members scrambled to close them, but it was already too late. The Vasa kept tilting, filling with water, and sank less than a nautical mile from where it had launched, in full view of the horrified crowd. It hadn't even cleared the harbor. Some historians estimate around 30 people lost their lives that day, around the total of 150 on board, though exact figures remain debated. It was a national humiliation. An investigation followed almost immediately, with officials desperate to figure out who was responsible. Shipbuilders, sailors, and officials were questioned, but in the end, no one was formally punished. The ship had followed the king's own orders, and criticizing the king, even indirectly, still wasn't something anyone in that court was eager to do. For more than 3 centuries, the Vasa sat at the bottom of Stockholm's harbor, forgotten by almost everyone, except a handful of historians. Then, in 1961, it was carefully raised from the seafloor. And here's the almost unbelievable part. Because the Baltic Sea's cold, low-salt water doesn't support the wood-eating organisms found in most oceans, the ship had survived almost perfectly intact. Original carvings, original timber, even original rigging fragments were still there after 333 years underwater. Today, the Vasa sits fully restored inside its own museum in Stockholm, one of the most visited museums in Scandinavia. Millions of people have walked beneath its towering hull, staring up at a ship that never fired a shot in battle, never fought a single enemy, and yet became one of the most studied vessels in maritime history. Not because of how it was used, but because of how it failed. The Vasa wasn't sunk by cannon fire or bad weather. It was sunk by silence, by small compromises nobody wanted to question, and by a design flaw so subtle that it took modern researchers centuries to fully explain it. Sometimes, the most dangerous mistakes aren't the ones no one saw coming. They're the ones everyone was too afraid to mention out loud.